Okay, so we're just going to go over, well, I guess I'll introduce myself to start. I'm Bob Wright. I'm a professor of entomology at UNL, and also speaking will be Dr. Kyle Cook, who's going to cover soybean insects. So we're going to just cover some common corn insects in Nebraska, and we have 3 different types of corn rootworms you can run across in going from left to right. This is the western corn rootworm, the northern corn rootworm, and the southern corn rootworm. And the northern and western have very similar life cycles, and they overwinter as eggs, 1 generation a year. The southern corn rootworm is greatly different biology in a lot of ways. It has a lot broader host range. It does not overwinter in Nebraska. The adults overwinter further south, but it can show up on corn silks as a potential pest. Also, we can have stink bugs on both corn and soybeans, but the 2 most common species are the green stink bug and the brown stink bug, and these are the adult stage. Stink bugs undergo incomplete metamorphosis, so the immature stages are nymphs without wings, and their coloration is a little bit different than the adult stage and the immature stage. And then we have Japanese beetles, which attack a lot of different crops and plants, and they're active right now. They have a metallic green head and thorax and coppery covered elytra or wing covers. A key character is these white spots or white tufts of hair on the edge of the abdomen. They can feed on corn silks, and before the silks come out, they will also feed on the leaves. They may interfere with the pollination if they're very abundant. In the immature stage is a white grub in the soil, feeds on plant roots, and this is the overwintering stage, also 1 generation a year. We haven't had these as much in the past, but chinch bugs are a potential problem. And this shows all the different stages of chinch bugs. This is the adult stage here with the wings. Different stage nymphs have different coloration. A key character to look for in the adult is this X-shaped marking where the wings overlap. Has 2 generations a year. The first generation develops on small grains such as wheat, and then as the small grains mature, the chinch bugs will migrate out of the crop and move to surrounding crops, particularly, or grass crops, particularly corn or sorghum. And so on the field edges adjacent to the wheat, the corn or sorghum can be heavily damaged if they're abundant. This has been more of a problem in the southern half of the state than the northern half. Corn earworms can feed on both the vegetative corn in the whorl, but they're more of a concern or interest when they're feeding on grain. They typically feed in the ear tip, and they really don't do that much damage because they're restricted to the ear tip typically. Also, they're cannibalistic, so typically only 1 caterpillar will survive to maturity. Coloration can be very, very variable. From green, some can be almost dark black. On the darker ones, you can see these longitudinal stripes show up, as well as an orange colored head. The moths prefer to lay eggs on green silk, so fields in that stage are most attractive to the moths. And we have less of these than we used to, but European corn borers are still around. And there are 2 generations a year in Nebraska. Larvae can feed in both the whorl stage and reproductive stage. We scout typically for the egg masses, and they're sort of a unique appearance. They're flattened and they're laid in an overlapping pattern, look like fish scales. Typically on the undersides of the leaf, just before they're ready to hatch, you can see the black head of the caterpillar inside, and that means that they're getting ready, they're soon to hatch. And this can be important in terms of timing of control measures, knowing when they're going to hatch. They overwinter as larvae in the stalk or other plant residue. Another insect that we're right in the middle of right now is the western bean cutworm. The eggs are laid typically on the upper surface of leaves. The number of eggs per egg mass can be variable. They're round shaped or like a pinhead. They're creamy white when they're first laid, and they darken as they get older. Just before they're going to hatch, they're most dark. These are the newly hatched caterpillars. You can see the remains of the eggs here, and they feed in the corn grain. They initially will feed in the tassel, but as the tassel emerges, they start moving down toward the ear. When the caterpillars are about half grown, they have some white stripes on the thoracic shield, which is a characteristic to look for. And unlike the corn earworm, we can have multiple surviving caterpillars of western bean cutworm, sometimes as many as 4 to 5 caterpillars per ear. They're not restricted to the ear tip. They can bore into the husk in the middle of the ear or the butt of the ear. And so if you have a lot of them, they can do a lot of damage. And they overwinter as a full-grown caterpillar in the soil, 1 generation per year. And we're just starting to see these show up now in Nebraska. Cornleaf aphids, or there are a couple other aphid species we can see in Nebraska. Typically, they can show up in late whorl stage corn. And then as the tassel emerges, they'll feed in the tassel and then move down and feed around the ear as well. They can vary in color from this light green to a bluish green color. A key character to look for is black legs, black antennae, and black cornicles or tailpipes here on the abdomen. If they're abundant during pollination, their honeydew may interfere with pollination. That would have to be a very high population. Oftentimes we have hot spots within a field. Individual plants will be heavily infested and adjacent plants won't be. But these are starting to show up in corn. Right now I've seen some reports from field scouts. And I'll stop here. Let's see, trying to stop here. I was gonna say, Kyle, why don't you share your screen so you can control the slides and the pointer?
Yep, sounds good, Bob. All right, set. Everybody see that okay?
Yep.
All right.
Just go to show,
Yep.
or show format or whatever. Yeah.
Okay, so there will be a little bit of overlap with a few of the insects that Bob just talked about. There are some that you'll find both in corn and soybeans, so I'll kind of skim over those a little bit. The first one we have here is bean leaf beetle. These are small, small chrysomelid beetles, about 1/4 of an inch. The color is really quite variable. They can range from yellow to really a bright reddish, and there's various shades in between. And in addition to that, there's also a variety of different patterns that you can see on their elytra. So those are the hardened wing covers. Sort of the general pattern is to have these four black spots surrounded with a black band. But that can vary. You can see here that band's broken. Some of those spots may be more or less missing, But one common characteristic that you're going to see on all of them is in this yellow circle, this black triangle at the base of the elytra. So that's going to be characteristic amongst beanleaf beetles and diagnostic, and that will be different, you know, from something else like southern corn rootworms or spotted cucumber beetles, which could also show up in soybeans. They're not going to have that triangle right there. They have the spots, but it's not going to form a triangle. Soybean aphids, some similar characteristics to the corn leaf aphid that Bob just talked about. These have, well, these are, you know, again, quite small, around 1/16 of an inch. The color is going to be yellowish, yellowish greenish, and then they're going to have fairly long black cornicles. So again, those tailpipes right there, they kind of have this overall teardrop shape and soft body without a really well-defined head and thorax. It's kind of just looks like one singular sort of body segment there. And these generally are going to prefer to feed on the underside of leaves, so that would be the prime spot where you would find those. Next is Dectys stem borer. This is a longhorn beetle, and here there's an image both of the adult on top and then the larva. So the adult is about 3/8 of an inch to 3/4 inch. The adults also are grayish, generally speaking. There can be a little bit of variation, and they have kind of a little bit of like a velvety texture or appearance to them. They have this banding on the antennae, so very long antennae, longer than the length of the body, and then you'll have kind of this gray and black banding on the antennae. Whoops, sorry about that. The larvae are much less likely to be encountered because those are going to be boring into the plant, but that's, you know, really the actual, this is the damaging stage right here, the larval stage. So these larvae, they bore into the stem, hollowing it out, and can cause weakening, lodging. And one of the common symptoms that you might see that you can identify these in the field will be flagging from where those larvae have bored into the main stem. You'll get flagging on those branches. But overall, the larvae, they have.
Yeah, Kyle, what does flagging mean?
Okay, so yeah, that's going to be basically like a dying petiole on the plant. So that, you know, the rest of the plant's green, and then you're going to have sort of this dead branch where that's, you know, going to be kind of a characteristic flag. I don't know, Bob, you can probably describe that better than I just did, but.
Yeah, no, it's just that flagging is a term that a lot of people wouldn't know what that means. Yeah. So you have some dead leaflets in the midst of a green canopy. Yeah.
There you go. That's a much better way of stating that. The larvae, they're have kind of a dark reddish orangish head, which is relatively small compared to the rest of the body, but otherwise the body is whitish to yellowish, and then you know, no obvious legs, and then deeply segmented body, so it looks sort of like an accordion. But that you'd have to open up the stem to find those inside.
And Kyle, I would just back up and say that I've had some producers, I mean, this is like past the competition time frame, but when they've noticed, like, all of a sudden they have like certain spots that their soybeans are lodging, you know, when they're pretty much all developed, and we're able to split that stalk open and try to see that. So
yeah,
it's kind of another good way to spot those.
Yep. The next is really an emerging issue in soybeans, soybean gall midge. These are the larvae of a small fly, The fly is, the adult is about the size of a mosquito, looks fairly similar to a mosquito, but the larvae here they feed, feed just underneath the epidermis and cause this gall. So the larvae, depending on the developmental stage, they vary in color from sort of this whitish or pinkish to a bright orange as they mature, and they cause the black calluses. So those are the galls, and those are really evident down around the base of the stem. So you can see all this blackening around the stem, and that gall, those calluses will be evident on the outside of the stem, and then you have to sort of peel back the epidermis, or some of those layers there, and that's where you would find the larvae underneath. And again, these can cause issues with lodging, killing the plant. There's cause a variety of issues. Tend to see them mostly around field edges, and that's where it seems to be worse. But in some cases can move into the field as well. Two-spotted spider mites, these are a really micro pest, tiny, around 1/50th of an inch. These have 8 legs like arachnids do, at least in most stages. The adult stage, it has 8 legs. They have a variety of colors. They can be reddish in some forms, but generally speaking, they're sort of a whitish or maybe a pale green. And then a diagnostic feature is the 2 white spots on the sides. These you can also find in corn too. I'll mention they have a really broad host range and will feed on all kinds of plants. Another really good characteristic for spotting these is going to be webbing on leaves. They can produce really significant amounts of webbing, and they produce a fairly characteristic, symptomology. This stippling of the leaves, which will cause them to turn, kind of whitish or, yellowish at first, and then eventually dying with a kind of a crusty brown texture. And then you also get a lot of kind of debris that tangles up in that webbing, and so you may see leaves that look dirty when they're infested with these spider mites. Japanese beetles. This was covered with a corn pest, so I won't go over all the diagnostic characteristics. But again, this can also be a defoliator in soybeans. A green clover worm. So these are moths. The caterpillar is the important stage here as a defoliator in soybeans. A characteristic is going to be the three prolegs in the middle of the body, which is kind of hard to see on this, but there's 3 prolegs in the middle, and then you have one at the end, 1 pair of prolegs. And the prolegs for caterpillars, those are, these are not true legs, but that's on the abdomen or the back end. Those are sort of the fleshy appendages that they use, essentially like legs. They kind of use those to grab onto things. Otherwise, these caterpillars are green with white striping. And, in the field, if you actually see these, sort of a characteristic is that they'll wiggle violently when touched. And then again, like with corn, there's also stink bugs that will feed in soybeans. Generally speaking, stink bugs are going to be identified by kind of their shield shape, or kind of the pentagonal shape, so a bit like a pentagon or 5 sides. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sides. Some it's more, sort of more conspicuous than in others. These are variable in size depending on the species, but some of our larger species like the green and the brown, they can be around 5/8 of an inch. And again, there's 2, a handful of species, but really the primary ones are going to be the green stink bug up here on top, and then the 1 spotted and brown stink bug, which really look generally speaking, pretty indistinguishable. Females are hard to tell apart. The males of one spotted have this dark spot on the underside that brown stink bugs don't have. That's what I have for sort of some of the diagnostic characteristics. I don't know if you wanted to do questions right now for us or just move on.
I think just any questions that anybody might have would be great. So I'm just going to throw out, you know, during the competition, there could be maybe like a picture of a bug, and some of you kids might have to identify what that might be and how to properly control it. Are those some of the things that maybe you're thinking about?
And there might be some insects we didn't show that are on the quiz.
Exactly. Absolutely. And I will also let the teams know that today my office manager sent the corn soybean guides like via like express methods so that you all have them by Monday. So those are fair game, we'll just say. But you know, this is just kind of questions. Like, are you guys seeing anything out in the field that you have questions about, or?
Like I was going to mention during Kyle's talk on soybean insects, we're starting to see spider mites in soybeans in some parts of the state. So you might be able to see those in your local area or the injury.
So can everyone see my screen? The pretty picture.
It looks great.
Awesome. All right. So this is, yeah, just going to be kind of picture shows. But one of the first, so first we're going to talk about some corn diseases. One of the first ones is one that we probably spend the most time talking about. It's a relatively new disease in Nebraska. It was identified actually for the first time in the United States about four or 5 years ago, and we've been seeing it with increasing incidence throughout the state. And it is bacterial leaf streak of corn, and has these very, very striking foliar symptoms. It is a bacterial disease, and so one of the important things to remember is that fungicides do not control this disease, which is one of the reasons that knowing this disease compared to a lot of our other foliar fungal diseases is very important. But one of the ways that we tend to identify it in the laboratory, at least from a visual observation, is I'll look at the leaf, but then I'll always look at it backlit. And so that's the picture that we have here on the right. And so that's just holding it up against the light. And really those lesions just kind of turn almost a neon green color. It's really, really beautiful. At least if you're a pathologist, something like that. But I mentioned that it does look very similar to this other fungal disease of corn, gray leaf spot. And so in general, so here we have a corn leaf that has a few different lesions on it. We have one gray leaf spot lesion up at the top, and then we have a few bacterial leaf streak lesions down at the bottom. And so at this stage, it's getting to be the point where we can differentiate these two diseases. Gray leaf spot tends to look much more rectangular. Gray leaf spot is caused by the fungal pathogen, Cercospora zoonotus. But that really tends to form just rectangular lesions on the leaves for the most part, whereas the lesions for bacterial leaf streak tend to be much more wavy and have much more wavy margins is one of the big things that we look for to differentiate. Unfortunately, early on, as we have some of the other lesions that aren't identified on this picture, are very early lesions, those are next to impossible to differentiate aside from a laboratory analysis. So no matter how often you've been looking at some of these diseases out in the field, sometimes they still do need to come into the lab to see what exactly it is. But here we have another picture kind of looking at it backlit. And so we have the nice rectangular gray leaf spot lesions up towards the top. And really, if you look above the midrib there, you know, those lesions, they've really just almost stacked on top of each other like bricks. And so it's then one of the things about gray leaf spot, it does tend to be vein limited. It does not cross those secondary veins very well in corn. But then down below, again, we have some more lesions of the bacterial leaf streak. Again, much wavier margins. They do have a little bit different color when backlit. And again, that looking at these two diseases, backlit is very important. Whenever I talk about diagnostics for bacterial leaf streak especially, cannot stress enough to hold it up to the light and look for that neon yellow and green. So the next disease that I'm going to talk about, or diseases, are our rust diseases of corn, and these are really starting to show up right now as well. Well, common rust has been going on for about a month now in corn. Southern rust within the past week has really picked up. And again, it's very important to be able to differentiate these two diseases. And the reason for that is common rust is very common. It's actually best controlled through genetic resistance, which is already bred into most of our commercial corn lines. So normally there is no sort of chemical control that is needed for common rust. Southern rust, on the other hand, has next to no genetic resistance and is best controlled through the use of fungicides. So it is really important when growers get this in their field, when growers start to see rust show up in their field, that they know, is it common rust or is it southern rust? And so some of the ways that we differentiate these two diseases is common rust tends to be a little bit more of a brick red color. Common rust also tends to show up kind of more in patches like we have over here. Whereas southern rust is much more orange. We also tend to have a larger yellow halo or a larger area of chlorosis that surrounds the southern rust pustules. And so that is one way that we can differentiate them, just kind of based on color. But one of the other things that people will often look at is the back side of the leaf. And so here we have two top side of the leaf pictures. But if we were to look at the back of the leaf, we would see these same pustules for common rust. Southern rust tends not to form these pustules on the back side of the leaves. And so that's another way that we can differentiate these two rust diseases out in the field. But as I was having a conversation with someone about this just a couple of hours ago, fungi, insects are the same way, really, but they don't read the textbooks. And so we talk about these common symptoms. I say southern rust generally doesn't form pustules on the underside of the leaf. I got 2 samples of southern rust in today where I found pustules on the underside of the leaf. So just because it's an uncommon symptom doesn't mean that that's everything. And whenever we are working on diagnostics, it's really important not to only focus on the symptoms that we see. It's very important to actually be able to see that, to be able to see the organism that is causing injury. Next, another one of our diseases, one that kind of put Nebraska plant pathology on the map, is Goss's bacterial wilt and blight. And this is another disease that we see fairly commonly in Nebraska. Typically not very widespread, which is at least not widespread anymore, which is very good because we can have very severe yield loss with this. But Some of the symptoms that we see with Goss's bacterial wilt and blight is just these long lesions on the leaf that kind of look shiny or water soaked is how we describe them in the pathology world, which we can really see some good pictures of the water soaking. But then often in these lesions, we're going to see some black frecks or black specks or freckles as well that are occurring. And so one of the original names for this was actually Goss's freckle blight and wilt. Another great way that we can identify this disease out in the field is by splitting the stems. And so whenever you are out in the field doing any diagnostics, a pocket knife is going to be one of your best friends. And so I always split stems, and if we split stems that are infected with Goss's bacterial wilt, we get kind of what we have here in this top right picture, where the individual, kind of those individual strands within the corn stalk turn black and are infected. And so it just kind of looks like a bunch of black little circles, often more concentrated on one side though. And here we have just another picture of it. And so we can see some of the dark freckles as well, but then there's that glossy exudate and water soaking that kind of make it look a little shiny. Next one that we're seeing a lot of in Nebraska this year as well is northern corn leaf blight. This is caused by Exocerohilum tursicum is the name of the fungus, but the characteristic of this pathogen that we always look for, or this disease, will be these kind of long cigar-shaped lesions on the leaves. Sometimes these lesions may come to a bit of a point, but generally the lesions aren't terribly pointed. So really just kind of looks like a long cigar. And this is another one of our diseases that is best controlled by foliar fungicides. Although there is some resistance available, being able to apply those fungicides really is the prime way that growers control this one out in the field. So moving away from corn diseases, unless anybody has any questions on corn diseases or is curious about something I did not show. All right. In that case, we'll go on to soybeans. So soybeans, one that we're seeing we tend to see a lot of this time of year is late season Phytophthora root and stem rot. This is a disease that causes infection early on in the season, kind of right at emergence. But depending on the field tolerance of your soybean, the seedlings may survive. If the seedlings die, then we have damping off is the general term for it. But the seedlings that survive for Phytophthora, they'll start growing, and will actually be growing just fine right until about the time that they turn to the reproductive stages of growth. So kind of once we start to see flowers on the plants, when plants reach the reproductive stages, all sorts of different things change. And so there are certain diseases that we tend to see more in the vegetative growth, and so those that we tend to see more in the reproductive growth. But for Phytophthora, once they have made that switch to the reproductive growth stage, which tends to be during the heat of the summer as well, when they have this compromised root and stems, root system and stems, is we'll just get this sudden rotting or sudden wilting that can occur. Often it's just going to be a couple of plants in a row. Sometimes there may be 30 plants that are healthy and then just one dead one, like we have here, and then the next 30 are completely healthy as well. Doesn't always affect widespread areas, but it certainly can. one of the ways that we can easily identify this disease out in the field. So again, we have this wilting that occurs, but the leaves and petioles remain attached, which is important. Some of our other wilt diseases, the leaves drop. And so sudden death syndrome of soybeans can look somewhat similar to this, but with those, the petioles remain attached, but the leaves drop. So with Phytophthora, both the leaves and petioles remain attached. The other thing that we tend to look for with Phytophthora will just be a dark black lesion that is kind of working its way up the stem from the soil line. Sometimes it may extend 2 to 3 nodes up the stem as well. But one thing that we need to be careful about, again, scouting is very important. We always need to know what we're dealing with before implementing any management. Is we go out to a field and we see something like this, and we think, boy, we have a small patch of beans that are wilted, leaves and petioles have remained attached. We're dealing with Phytophthora here. But then we go and actually split the stem, and what do you know? We have some of those soybean gall midge larvae in there, those little orange larvae that we have a few of. Let's see if I can circle. So here are a couple of them, but again, always very, very important to know what we're dealing with when we're out scouting. And again, pocket knives, very, very important. Get a lot of samples in where people think it's Phytophthora and it's gall midge, or people think it's gall midge and it's Phytophthora. So these two can be very easily confused. But other one is we tend to see a fair amount of in Nebraska is sudden death syndrome of soybeans, and this one is caused by a soil-borne fungal disease. It's a fusarium virgiliforme, but it tends to show up in pockets throughout the field. And as you can guess, the way that based on its name, it can cause a lot of damage very quickly. The picture that we have here on the left, those being a majority of those pockets were completely green 2 weeks before this picture was taken. So really over the course of a week or two, we can have really severe and sudden death of soybeans. But symptoms tend to show up first at the top of the plant. And so earlier, the other Kyle was kind of talking about flagging. We really talk about flagging with sudden death syndrome as well, where we'll just kind of get these bright yellow leaves that have interveinal chlorosis. And unfortunately, I did not pull a picture of the leaf symptoms, unfortunately, but we can see them pretty well here on this picture on the left here, or I'm sorry, the picture on the right, where we have the entire plant. And if you look up towards the top of the plant, we do have a lot of leaves that have dropped. The petioles have remained attached and staying upright, whereas the leaves have dropped. But the leaves that remain, they have this interveinal necrosis. And so this fungal disease causes a toxin that kills the tissue between the veins. And so we kind of get these bright green or yellow lesions that occur just between the veins before eventually killing the entire leaf. And another one of our foliar fungal diseases of soybeans, this is probably our most damaging foliar fungal disease of soybeans. This is frog eye leaf spot, and this is caused by Cercospora sogina, so a relative of the gray leaf spot of corn fungus. But one of the things with frog eye leaf spot that we tend to look for will be kind of smaller irregularly shaped lesions that often have a dark black halo around them, or maybe kind of have a bit of a frog eye shape. And that is fairly typical of this disease. Now, this disease can also look like a few other things. There are some fungicides. If we have some fungicides that can cause injury that looks almost exactly like this. So again, knowing the field history, knowing what was sprayed, any sort of application dates, very important when you're out there actually looking at any of these diseases. And another probably one of my favorite diseases is soybean cyst nematode. And so here we just have, you guys can see all of these kind of white or cream colored little bumps that are all over the roots. Those are female nematodes that are full of eggs. And so this disease, unfortunately, does not have any sort of above ground symptoms. We have seen 40% yield loss with this disease with beans that look perfect at the end of the season. They are perfectly green, they're chest high, they put out plenty of pods. The seeds are just a lot smaller because they have all of these nematodes that are there feeding and stealing nutrients. So one of the only way that we can really identify soybean cyst nematode is really by looking at the root system, or by looking, or by taking a soil test. And so here I have a lot of cysts here on this central root. But if we look up towards the top of this picture, the top left corner, we can see a rhizobia nodule. And so the rhizobia nodule are much, much larger than these cysts are. And so that's really important that when we're trying to differentiate soybean cyst nematode from rhizobia, is going to be size, is really the biggest thing that we tend to look for. Within each one of these little cream colored cysts, there's anywhere from 50 to 400 eggs. So populations can really skyrocket with this disease. As far as management goes, there's really no good chemical control of this one. So all management goes back to choosing a resistant variety. And here I have a zoomed in picture of some of those cysts as well that we've seen. But often as we're looking out in the field, we're just going to see maybe an area that's a little bit smaller, or maybe you're thinking, oh, maybe there's some soil compaction, or maybe there's a slight nutrient deficiency, or really some sort of general root problem is what we always get with this nematode. Really no good above ground symptoms, but when we look underground, we can find a lot of these nematodes. And another one that's going to be actually showing up right about now as well, in kind of the central part of the state, is Sclerotinia stem rot. This disease has increased in prevalence over the last about 10 years, but it can be very, very devastating. One of the worst things about this disease is once we start to see symptoms like this, we are too late for any sort of control, and we can't do anything. The fungus will continue to spread through these fields, but once we start to see symptoms, we can't do anything. So we really need to make sure that we're out when we are trying to control for this disease. So symptoms like this tend to show up in the later reproductive stages. Actually, here we have some more pictures. But we start to see a lot of this death in the mid to late reproductive stages. The only time that we can apply a fungicide to help control this disease is in the early reproductive stages. And so if we have not applied a fungicide by R3, we will not have any control for this disease. Symptoms often don't start to show up until R4 to R5. So you can see where some of the issues are. But if we are actually out in the field and we're crawling around through the canopy and being very intimate with the plants, we may start to see some things. And one thing that we will see early on will be potentially something like we have here on this bottom left picture, where we'll just start to get some white fungal growth that's occurring kind of right at the soil line and kind of working its way up is one of the things that we tend to see. And then some other, a couple of bacterial diseases of soybeans. Bacterial blight is one that we're seeing a lot of right now. Bacterial blight is caused by a xanthomonid bacterium. But one of the ways that we can differentiate this disease from frog eye leaf spot, like I was talking about, is really we don't have, so first the color of the lesion. Frog eye tends to have a kind of a white or brown lesion or light brown lesion, whereas bacterial blight is much darker brown and really doesn't have that nice margin that frog eye has. But bacterial blight is one of our bacterial diseases that shows up in the upper canopy first, and it likes the heat. And so that's one important thing to remember with bacterial blight compared to bacterial pustule. Wait a minute. Did I get those confused? I got those confused. Bacterial blight doesn't really like the heat. So bacterial blight tends to show up more in our cooler temperatures. So I think Brandy's going to allow you guys to have a few resources. Resources are very important. Even people who look at this stuff all day long, it's easy to get them confused. So that's important to remember. But bacterial pustule, one of our other bacterial diseases, these lesions tend to show up much more in the upper canopy, whereas bacterial blight shows up in the lower canopy first. And then bacterial blight also tends to be much more associated with the veins, whereas bacterial blight is kind of showing up wherever wherever on the leaves. And that is all that I had. And so I don't know if there are any questions.